There is a particular kind of political move that does not need to shout to be devastating. It does not need a press conference brawl or a Twitter war or a dramatic televised confrontation. The most effective kind of geopolitical humiliation is the kind that arrives quietly, wrapped in the language of national ambition, and makes the person being humiliated look small, not through insult, but through contrast. On April 27th, 2026, one day before his government's spring economic update, and while Donald Trump's tariff regime was still battering Canadian industries from steel to softwood, lumber to automobiles, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the Canadian Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa and announced the creation of something Canada has never had before in its 159-year history, a sovereign wealth fund. 25 billion Canadian dollars in initial federal capital, a new arm's-length crown corporation called the Canada Strong Fund, a retail investment product that will allow ordinary Canadians to buy into the fund directly, like a government bond, and earn dividends from the country's own gros WTF. Not a bailout, not a subsidy, not a relief check. A national investment engine explicitly designed to break Canada's dependence on the United States and build a new economic future, with or without Washington's cooperation. The timing was not accidental, the message was not subtle, and the target could not have missed it. To understand what Carney just did and why it matters so profoundly, you have to understand what the last year has felt like for ordinary Canadians. Because the Canada Strong Fund was not designed in a boardroom. It was designed in response to a crisis, that has been grinding away at the Canadian economy and Canadian identity for months, and whose author sits in the Oval Office. Donald Trump's tariff regime, which Carney described on April 19th as having raised American tariff levels to levels last seen during the Great Depression, has imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, a 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles, and sweeping tariffs on Canadian forest products. These are not symbolic measures. They are structural wounds to industries that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. The aluminum manufacturing sector contracted by 15.5% in 2025. Motor vehicle manufacturing fell by 11.6%. Total GDP in tariff-affected industries declined by 4% for the year. More than 109,000 private sector jobs to be here lost in Canada in just the first 2 months of 2026. Youth unemployment stands at 13.8%, the highest level in a decade. The Canadian economy, which had spent most of the previous decade as one of the G7's steadier performers, finished 2025 in outright contraction, shrinking by 0.6% in the fourth quarter. Trump did not stop at tariffs. He questioned Canada's sovereignty, repeatedly claiming Canada could become the 51st state of the United States. He suggested Canada exists only because the United States allows it to. When Carney said at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026 that economic coercion of smaller nations by great powers was unacceptable, a remark widely understood as aimed directly at Trump. The American president responded with characteristic venom. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump said. You remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements? Trump's Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, dismissed Canada's trade diversification strategy with contempt. When a Canadian trade negotiator, Sugg, suggested that time was on Canada's side because political pressure on Trump would grow as the American economy weakened, Lutnick said, "That is like the worst strategy I've ever heard. They suck. Look, we are a $30 trillion economy." He then mocked Carney's outreach to China, saying, "Carney has a problem with us. He gets on a plane and goes to China. Does he think the Chinese economy is going to buy his stuff?" On April 3rd, 2026, Volodymyr Zelensky stood before reporters and delivered a number that stopped every military analyst in the world mid-sentence. Over 35,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in the single month of March 2026. 1 month. 35,000 men. It was, Zelensky confirmed, the highest single-month loss Russia had suffered since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. A record. And not a record by a marginal amount. A record achieved in a month where Ukrainian drone operations, according to the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Force, were directly responsible for a substantial proportion of those casualties, with the Ukrainian General Staff reporting 1,700 Russian casualties on a single day in mid-March from drone strikes alone. The number 35,000 in a single month is not by itself the crisis. The crisis is what that number means when you place it next to a different number that Russian state media has no interest in publicizing. The number of Russian contract soldiers successfully recruited in March 2026 was approximately 28,000 to 30,000, a figure that intelligence, analysts, regional budget data, and the research of German economist Janis Klug, who has been tracking Russian military recruitment through regional bonus payment data since 2022, all converge on. Russia lost 35,000 men in March. Russia recruited fewer than 30,000 replacements. For the FO, Earth consecutive month. From December 2025 through March 2026, Russia's losses have exceeded the number of soldiers it has actually been able to bring in. The arrivals to departures balance, as Ukrainian intelligence describes it, has been firmly negative for 4 months running. That is the real crisis, not the losses themselves, as catastrophic as they are. The fact that Russia is losing soldiers faster than it can replace them at the moment of its greatest military commitment, with no politically viable path to closing the gap. To understand how Russia arrived at this moment and what the trajectory of that arrival means for the war's future, you have to start not with April 2026, but with the full accounting of what the Russian military has already lost. Because the losses that have been accumulating since February 24th, 2022 are, when assembled into a single picture, unlike anything in modern warfare outside of the world wars. And the picture has been systematically underestimated at every stage by analysts who were not yet willing to believe that a nuclear-armed great power could absorb attrition at this rate and still be advancing. The CSIS found that 60,000 to 70,000 Russian soldiers died in the first year of the war in Ukraine alone, more than in all of Russia's other wars since World War II combined. More than all of Afghanistan over 15 years, more than both Chechen wars combined, more than every other post-Soviet military conflict Russia has fought. The first year of the Ukraine war was, according to that analysis, 25 times deadlier than Chechnya and 35 times more lethal than Afghanistan. Those comparative figures deserve a moment. A war that is 35 times deadlier per year than the Soviet-Afghan War, a conflict that is widely credited as a primary contributing factor to the Soviet Union's political collapse, has been underway for over 4 years, and the rate of death has not declined. It has risen. In December 2025 alone, Russia lost more troops than the Soviet Union lost during 10 years in Afghanistan. 1 month versus 10 years. That is not an editorial claim. It is an arithmetic comparison of documented casualty figures from a Western Security Institute applied to official Soviet historical records. As of April 22, 2026, Ukraine's General Staff reported total Russian personnel losses since the start of the invasion at approximately 1,121,450 killed and wounded. That is the Ukrainian operational figure which Western analysts apply appropriate skepticism to while using it as a directional indicator. The independent Western estimates are, if anything, equally devastating in their convergence. In February 2026, former CIA Director William Burns told the Financial Times that Russian casualties stood at approximately 1.1 million. The Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service, which has some of the RPS Russia-facing intelligence capacity in NATO, estimated 1 million killed and wounded. Bloomberg reported a Western official's estimate of 1.2 million including 430,000 casualties in 2024 and 415,000 in 2025 alone. The Center for Strategic and International Studies put the figure at 1.2 million total, with as many as 325,000 killed between February 2022 and December 2025. The Economist, using satellite data and more than 200 credible estimates from West, Turn governments and independent researchers reported that Russia's total casualty toll had increased by 60% since the start of 2025, with over 100,000 soldiers reportedly killed in that year alone, and a kill ratio of roughly 5 Russian soldiers for every 1 Ukrainian. The Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service, in an April 2026 estimate, put the figure at 1.2 million permanent losses, including more than 500,000 dead. If you pull up a map of the Western Hemisphere and trace your finger along the great continental road that runs from Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina, you will notice something very strange happening right around the point where T-motorable road in the world by most reckonings, stretching nearly 19,000 miles through 14 countries and connecting the Colombia, the road simply stops. It ends in dense jungle, picks up again about 60 miles later on the other side, and leaves an unbridged gap in the middle that has frustrated travelers, infuriated engineers, and puzzled curious map reader S for the better part of a century. This gap has a name, the Darien Gap, and the reasons why it has never been closed, why the United... To understand the Darien Gap, you have to first understand what you are actually looking at when you zoom in on that stretch of the map. The gap is not a small inconvenience. It is a wilderness of roughly 10,000 square miles of some of the heeds, 150 inches per year in some areas, which is enough to keep the ground perpetually saturated and to turn what few footpaths exist into rivers of mud for months at a time. The rivers themselves are unpredictable and often impassable, swelling without warning during tropical storms and changing course in ways that make traditional bridge building nearly impossible. The wildlife ranges from jaguars and venomous snakes to swarms of mosquitoes carrying diseases that have killed travelers for centuries. And layered on top of all that natural hostility is a human element that is just as dangerous when owned by folks. The Pan American Highway was conceived in the 1920s as a grand continental project that would connect all the Americas through a single unified road network. The vision was deeply rooted in the optimism of that era, the sense that modern engineering could conquer any obstacle and that economic integration through infrastructure would bring prosperity and peace to the hemisphere. Construction proceeded steadily through the middle of the 20th century, with governments from Canada to Chile investing heavily in their respective sections of the route. By the 1960s, almost the entire length of the highway was complete, except for that one stubborn gap in the Darien. And at that point, the obvious question becomes, why not simply finish the job? The technology existed. The political will, at least in some quarters, existed. Regional governments generally supported the idea. And yet every serious proposal to close the gap has been defeated, delayed, or quietly strangled in its cradle. And the single most important reason for that pattern of defeat, though it is rarely stated openly in official documents, is that the United States has consistently worked behind the scenes to prevent the road from being completed. The second major reason for American opposition is drug interdiction, and this reason has grown more important over time as the cocaine trade has become one of the defining features of the regional economy. The Darien Gap sits directly between the cocaine-producing regions of Colombia and the markets of North America, and for decades the traffickers have used the jungle as one of primary smuggling corridors. The difficulty of the terrain means that the traffickers have had to move their product in relatively small quantities, usually carried on foot or in small boats, which limits the volume that can reach the United States by this particular route. A completed highway would change that calculation dramatically. Instead of sending a few backpacks of cocaine through the jungle each week, the traffickers could potentially send tractor trailers loaded with tons of product directly up the Pan American Highway toward Mexico and the American border. The Drug Enforcement Administration and various American agencies concerned with narcotics have consistently opposed any proposal that would make overland SMU going easier. And the Darien Gap, for all its human costs, is from their perspective a useful friction in the trafficking supply chain that they are not eager to remove. The third reason, which has become increasingly prominent in recent years, is migration control. The Darien Gap has become one of the primary overland routes for migrants attempting to reach the United States from South America and beyond, with hundreds of thousands of people attempting the crossing each year. The conditions are horrific, the death toll is staggering, and the human suffering involved is almost impossible to overstate. But from the perspective of American policymakers concerned with border security, the difficulty of the Darien crossing functions as a filter that reduces the total number of migrants who can physically reach the United States. A paved highway through the gap would remove that filter entirely. Instead of requiring migrants to walk for days or weeks through jungle that kills many of them, the journey could be made in hours by bus or car, and the number of people attempting to reach the American border would likely increase by orders of magnitude. Successive American administrations, whatever their stated positions on immigration, have quietly recognized that the Darien Gap serves an unofficial border enforcement function that no wall or fence along the Mexican border could replicate. The fourth reason is environmental, and it is the one most commonly cited in public discussions because it is the most politically palatable. The Darien rainforest is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the plains. Home to thousands of species of plants, animals, and insects, many of which exist nowhere else on Earth. It is also the ancestral home of several indigenous peoples, most notably the Embera, the Wunan, and the Guna, whose traditional ways of life depend on the intact forest. Building a highway through the region would inevitably trigger the kind of development that has deforested so much of the Amazon in Central America over the past 50 years, with logging, ranching, and agricultural expansion following the road into previously inaccessible territory. Environmental organizations have mobilized repeatedly against proposed highway routes, arguing that the ecological cost of closing the gap would be catastrophic and irreversible. The American government has publicly aligned itself with these environmental concerns, and this alignment has provided cover for what are often, at their core, strategic objections rooted in the agricultural, drug, and migration concerns described above. Think back to September 2019. Iranian drones and cruise missiles launched a devastating strike on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, the single most important piece of energy infrastructure on the planet, processing roughly 5% of the world's daily oil supply. The facility was engulfed in fire. Satellite images showed massive destruction. And the world watched to see what America would do. President Trump's response was careful, measured, and deeply unsatisfying to Riyadh. He said America was locked and loaded, and then he did essentially nothing militarily, No retaliatory strike, no escalation. Just words. For Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, sitting in Riyadh and watching smoke pour out of his most critical oil facility, that moment was a turning point. If America would not respond to a direct attack on the kingdom's most vital infrastructure, what exactly was the security guarantee worth? And then came the Afghanistan withdrawal in August 2021. The images of the chaotic American retreat from Kabul, 2 decades of investment, thousands of lives, trillions of dollars evaporating in a matter of days, sent a shockwave through every American ally in the world. But nowhere was the reaction more visceral, more strategic, more consequential than in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. The leaders of the Gulf states watched America abandon its partners, leave behind its equipment, and retreat in a manner that no one could describe as dignified. And they asked themselves a question that would reshape the entire geopolitical order of the Middle East. If America could walk away from Afghanistan after 20 years, could it walk away from us? That question did not lead to panic. It led to strategy. And the strategy that emerged from palaces in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha over the following years was meticulous, patient, and devastatingly rational. The strategy was called strategic diversification, and at its heart was a decision to stop depending on any single superpower for security. And the partner that benefited most from that decision was China. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Because the Chinese approach to Saudi Arabia was as different from the American approach as it is possible to imagine. America came to Saudi Arabia with conditions, human rights concerns, democratic reform demands, congressional debates about arms sales, public criticism of the kingdom's leadership. China came with some, I think, far simpler and far more appealing to a monarchy that had spent decades navigating American political cycles and congressional oversight. China came with no condition, at all. No lectures about press freedom, no Senate hearings questioning whether to approve the next arms deal. No Twitter storms from American politicians denouncing Saudi Arabia's domestic policies, just technology, trade, and the kind of transactional respect that absolute monarchies find infinitely easier to deal with than messy democratic politics. The first major signal that something fundamental was shifting came in the space of just 12 months between 2022 and 2023. In March 2022, Saudi Arabia had a phone call, not with Washington, with Beijing. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sat down with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and they discussed deepening military and economic cooperation in terms that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. That same year, Saudi Arabia announced it was considering pricing some of its oil sales to China in Chinese yuan rather than exclusively in US dollars. For anyone who understood the architecture of American global power, this was not just an economic news story, it was an act of geopolitical defiance. The entire foundation of American financial dominance since 1974 had been the agreement that oil would be sold in dollars. Pricing even a fraction of those sales in yuan was a crack in the foundation of the entire system. But the weapons deals were where the transformation became truly impossible to ignore. Let us be precise about what Saudi Arabia has been acquiring from China, because the details tell